The greatest obsession of the left is with the concept of equality. And where you've got equality, you have numbers, percentages. Like their communist forebears, they want a society where everybody is equal, as in everybody lives at the same state of existence, all the while carrying on about so-called diversity. And as a result, in communist societies, you have everybody living on the same level of impoverishment. The only way to get everybody equal is to have everybody in society living the same, you might say, flat existence. I've mentioned before, in Soviet Russia, road labourers earning the same amount of money as brain surgeons. This might be a slight exaggeration, but not by very much, I would think. Some years ago, the Australian Army, in its quest for women's equality, had this target of 14% women in its ranks over the next few years. My immediate reaction was, given what I know about maths, and given what I know about left-wingers' fixation with equality, I thought, well, why not 50%? This gave rise to the thought that there was such a thing as left-wing maths. I began to notice some very strange calculations left-wingers would engage in the way that they looked at equality and how the world functions. And I found that I could apply this principle to a lot of issues and arguments going on in society where there's an implicit acceptance of the enumeration of certain factual information which is supposed to inform us about the underlying truth of things and justice and so on. And I'm just going to go through a few instances where this principle of left-wing maths applies and how it totally skews the way people think about things and, as usual, allows them to win a lot of arguments where the use of numbers and figures they can use to skew the argument in their favour, but ignore numbers and percentages when it doesn't suit them. In the case of army recruitment, they picked this seemingly random number, 14%, which was supposed to more or less equal 50%, with reasoning that just escapes me, if you could call it reasoning, and which in the end is quite laughable. And this shameless reliance on figures and percentages utilised in a totally spurious way just reinforces the notion that whatever other fine qualities left-wingers might possess, the ability to work with numbers is not one of them. The classic case in point is the good old issue of the so-called gender pay gap. Talk about the big lie. The more it is spouted by feather-brained ideologues, the more credence it seems to have in wider society. Well, they're not really feather-brained. They know exactly what they're doing, but they also know that they can get away with it to a gormless and empty-headed populace. Yes, men collectively earn more money than women for a lot of reasons that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out. They work longer hours. They generally work at higher levels of responsibility than women generally want to take on. And despite what feminists say about the need for women to stay home and look after children, opinion polls have shown over the years that most women would do that if they could afford to, that they would rather be looking after their children than advancing a career. This is a calculation that women freely make about their priorities in life. The so-called gender pay gap is not some conspiracy to keep women down. It accurately reflects the free choices that women make about how they want to run their lives. It's well known that highly trained female doctors will generally wind up working part-time because they've gone off, got married and had a family, to name but one example. And it gets more idiotic. Just look at professional tennis players. Women play only half the amount of tennis that the top-ranking men do at a much lower level of speed, power and skill, than the men demonstrate. And despite this, they are paid exactly the same prize money. In the Grand Slams, you're talking prize money of something like $2 million. My latest take on the left-wing maths is the constantly spouted claim that Aborigines have been here for 40,000 years, and that fact on its own justifies treating them as a completely different class of people in society. Archaeologists can't say that the people we call Aborigines were the first people on this continent. There's good evidence that they were preceded by another people called the Negritos, or the Bushmen. These were the people of Truganini, the last so-called Aboriginal in Tasmania, and they've been largely ignored by historians because it goes against the narrative of Aboriginal political activism. And even in the unlikely case of long habitation of this continent, these Aboriginal inhabitants have very little to show for their long-lived occupancy of this land. There wasn't so much as a single building on this entire continent when Europeans first discovered Australia. But then I started applying my principle of left-wing maths to the issue, and you come up with some very interesting insights. So we think that the vast amount of time these Aborigines are supposed to have been here is a thing. The figures are a thing. What thing, I dare to ask? So if we're looking at figures, why is it just numbers of years? Why can't it be numbers of the population of this country? There are hundreds of thousands of people living in Australia of Italian ancestry, Vietnamese, Chinese, Polish, you name it. Hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions of people. Are we talking figures now? Where is their voice to Parliament? Why not? What's wrong with the Chinese? What's wrong with the Vietnamese? What's wrong with the Lebanese? No voice to Parliament for them, because you're of the wrong race. It's only the people of the black race, because of the vast numbers of years of their occupancy of the land. Your vast numbers of a percentage of the population, they just don't count. And I'm thinking, why? What about the Italians who've been in Australia for 70 great years? The Lebanese have been here for 50 great years. The Chinese, going back into the 1800s. Where is their voice to Parliament? Where is their flag? The presence of the Australian Aborigines for 40,000 years affects me on a day-to-day basis. How? I know about the Italians after the Second World War coming to Australia and doing the manual labour that built Australia's houses, suburbs, roads. An Italian has built some of the tallest buildings in Melbourne. Have you ever been to a Chinese restaurant? And how about a falafel? These are influences that affect vast numbers of Australians on a daily basis. Where is their voice to Parliament? Where is their flag? And if not, why not? And that applies to every ethnic group in Australia. Indeed, every group of people, full stop. How about Bible-believing Christians? Where's their voice to Parliament? Where's their flag? But they're not good enough. Is this distinguishing by race? Racism? There would be more people in Australia doing crochet as we speak right now than there are people in the Torres Strait Islands. There would be more people playing lawn bowls in retirement homes. What about alpaca breeders? But you say we are talking about people who suffered oppression. But of course the Chinese, the Italians and the Irish suffered oppression, a very loosely defined rubbery term. And just what specific oppression did the Torres Strait Islander people receive at the hands of the white patriarchy? I don't know of any specific instances of gross oppression for these people. but they do have their own flag. But there's an even bigger problem, because if you don't give the crochet knitters due recognition, they too are now oppressed by this logic. Now, not even the stupidest left-winger would claim that Europeans came to this continent and threw Aborigines out of their homes, threw them off their farms, moved into their factories and just took over the place. Now, they wouldn't openly say that, but that is exactly what they would like you to believe, and that is the implication behind most of what they say about Aboriginal dispossession. And indeed, the fatuous Bruce Pascoe, who falsely proclaims his Aboriginal ethnicity, he has been publicly found out on this false claim, and yet the likes of the ABC are still happy to proclaim him as an Aboriginal man simply because that's what he claims about himself, and for no other reason. And who has written a book which implies the very thing that I just mentioned, that Aborigines lived in settled communities with enclosures for animals, and relies on nothing other than the misreading of some historical sources. And white Australians are supposed to say sorry to Aboriginal Australians for having invaded their land, and that's all right, as long as we get a big fat thank you from those people for having brought Western civilization to this continent. That's 200 years of a technologically advanced society versus 40,000 years, supposedly, of hunter-gathering primitive existence. As for your welcome to country, let me welcome you to my country of 21st century civilization that gives you your four-wheel drive out in the car park, your TVs, washing machines and mobile phones. Now we have this totally ridiculous circumstance that has been going on since the commencement of the newly elected Labor government, where government announcements are now made against a backdrop of three flags. In 2022, following the election, these three flags appear with the Aboriginal flag in the centre, flanked by the official Australian flag on one side and the Torres Strait Islander flag on the other. So you've got 40,000 years. Well, I've got the Aboriginal population of Australia pegged at probably well under 1% of actual ethnic full-blooded Aborigines, with up to 3 or 4% of the population claiming supposed Aboriginal ancestry. And when you look at these people, and I am talking especially about the political activist class in this category, you only have to look at them to know that this is true, that these people are overwhelmingly of European ancestry. So why are the pitifully small numbers of these people in our society given so much significance against the millions and millions of people in this country who have other ancestry which counts for nothing? One set of figures counts for everything and another set of figures counts for nothing. How can that be? Well, my friends, it's all in left-wing maths. And what is even more manifestly idiotic is when we think about the Torres Strait Islanders, these people who have their own flag that is displayed on an equal footing as the flag of the rest of us 25 million Australians, which flanks the Indigenous flag. How many Australians have actually even met a Torres Strait Islander, for goodness sake? Okay, so let's get down to the analysis of some numbers. The Torres Strait Islands, which are by definition not even part of the Australian mainland, have a population of some 35,000 people. How, for goodness sake, does this justify these people having their own flag? ranking on the same level as the Australian flag. The flag of 25 million people. Guys, that's facts and figures and percentages right there. How do the interests of the total Australian population lose out to the interests of a people who have been here for, they say, 40,000 years? The last time I looked, 25 million is a lot bigger than 40,000, except in the idiotic mind frame of the ideological left. And one final point about the flags. So that's 3 flags for supposedly one country for people who are by nature philosophically not inclined to revere the idea of a flag in the first place. They have 3 where there should only be 1. That's left-wing maths for you. I have mentioned in a previous video a particularly outrageous example of left-wing maths where Australia's 1.3% of the world's carbon emissions is inflated into something like 5 times the emissions of the rest of the world. This is based on the carbon emissions of individual Australians compared to other individual people living in Darfur or Mali or something like that, which says nothing more than that we're an advanced industrialised country, and naturally the people of this country produce more carbon emissions for that simple fact alone, which as a per capita figure is practically meaningless when it comes to international policy regarding the climate emissions of nations on the international stage, which in the case of Australia is still just tiny. Talk about lies, damned lies and statistics. The audacity of people to run this argument is breathtaking, but it is a very good example of left-wing maths. That's all for now.